So let's talk about one issue that I've had with the new 40k detachments, where maybe my expectations haven't really met with reality, and I'll be interested to hear if any of you guys feel the same. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I just wanted to touch a bit of a vague feeling that I've had with some of the new detachments for the Space Marines and Tyranids, and perhaps just that quite a lot of players' armies might realistically not really have that much choice of ways to run their army from their actual collections that they have. For the most part, I do quite like detachments in Warhammer 40k. I think they are quite a cool idea to try and epitomise certain fighting styles in Warhammer, but without arbitrarily locking in some ways that factions fight just to, say, specific Space Marine chapters or Tyranid hive fleets or other things in lore that you might have painted your army as. Now we've had the new Tyranid Codex and Space Marine Codexes come out to give us a bit more of a flavour as to what we expect. I feel like for the most part they are quite popular and do genuinely do their job of trying to make different ways of playing an army genuinely quite different and interesting. It's definitely true that not all of them are super balanced, but perhaps compared with the sub-factions that 40k has had in the past, I think you could perhaps argue that they've been doing a bit better with these new detachments than some of the chapter type rules. What I wanted to talk about today, though, was that while a lot of these rules are quite fun and do push different armies in different directions, I was perhaps just a little bit surprised by how many just seem to almost solely focus around benefiting just a few units in the army roster. And perhaps the feeling that maybe quite a few of you might have had, in that if you don't really have a critical mass of the relevant units for one detachment, you might as well just not bother even looking at it. And if you're going for at least a somewhat strong list, you probably need to go for either the generic detachment or something that you've got enough models to create a bit of a skew list for. Say Ironstorm Spearhead in Space Marines, where you've got loads of tanks and vehicles, or Vanguard Onslaught in Tyranids, where you've got lots of the Vanguard Invader organisms. In the past edition or two, sub-faction type rules tended to maybe be a little bit more universal. Arguably, sub-faction choice was perhaps a little bit less impactful than it is now, given that now you basically only have the rules that apply to your sub-faction plus the datasheet rules, where previously the sub-faction rules that you'd choose would give you an army special rule, maybe a unique stratagem, a relic and warlord trait and things, but besides that you'd still have the vast majority of the common choices to the army available to you, loads of stratagems and relics and warlord traits that weren't tied to any one sub-faction. It maybe meant that, say, choosing one sub-faction over another in 8th and 9th edition didn't quite so heavily incentivise you not to play certain models, perhaps, as there might be some generic support choices that could really work out well for them, even if the sub-faction didn't do loads for them. With the way that Games Workshop designed the detachments, I do think it's probably to their credit that they generally have been quite light with the restrictions they place on units that you can bring in them. In general, for the most part, you can still bring basically whatever unit you want in whatever detachment, but it just means that in plenty of detachments there will literally be no support for your unit whatsoever bar their base datasheets, and realistically that's going to mean that people really quite heavily skew towards the unit that that detachment rewards. I definitely feel like it's not the worst thing in the world to have detachments that really operate quite differently to each other in game, but I maybe had hopes that there might have been a few more slightly more generic choices out of, say, the Tyranids and Space Marine Codexes. I feel like if you've got a very balanced miniature collection without too much emphasis on one unit subclass, you might actually have a surprisingly limited choice of things that are really viable. One example that I noticed for my own collection was maybe the Space Marine Firestorm Force. I definitely don't think that this is the worst example of the new detachments, as it does have some genuinely quite powerful rules that help out your firepower units and infantry, but still it feels like it's a detachment that I really want to like, but in reality it's probably not going to be the best one to go for, unless you have some quite specific units in your roster and a fair few of them. The detachment rule I think is quite useful. You get to count your weapons as assault weapons and get bonus strength at close range to them. Plus the Crucible of Battle stratagem is really quite general purpose. 1 CP for +1 to wound for your infantry when they're targeting the closest thing. That is genuinely quite meaningful. Beyond those rules though, the majority of the rest of the support options just don't do all that much for your more standard units. In particular, the stratagems have 3 of them very transport focused, so if you don't have transports and maybe the right units to have jumping out of those transports, you might be kind of unlikely to pick up this detachment as a result, even if you kind of like the core rule. Plus the Torrent Flamer stratagem again is kind of unit specific. You'd either want something like Flamestorm Aggressors or Infernus Marines for the most part. Most of the other targets might be alright to use it on, but in reality just not all that great when it's 2 CP. It was something that I've noticed for my own Space Marines with this one that I might just struggle to really justify playing it compared with the Gladius, besides just trying it out to make the most of the new rules. I definitely do have some transport vehicles, but probably not the optimal ones. I've got a Land Raider Crusader rather than a Redeemer, for example, and it's probably at least going to be a little while before I build up plenty of Torrent type weapons. I do tend to paint Space Marines quite slowly. As a result, and I feel like it might be the case for a few Space Marine collectors out there, while the right list for it might really be a good competition for the Gladius, a lot of players just might not have the right list for it, and therefore if you take the detachment, you're probably just directly making your army a little bit less powerful compared with just running it as Gladius, as it might support your standard units better. Perhaps another example that showcases this even better are things like the Tyranid Unending Swarm. Obviously, just from the detachment name, you are expecting that this will be one that goes heavy on the hordes, and it's going to be focused on creating a horde army of Tyranids. But I feel like if you really want to actually play this and for it to be better than, say, the Invasion Fleet, you are going to need an awful lot of the little guys. The detachment rule is only for Endless Multitude units, the stratagems again are only for Endless Multitude units, so the Termagants and Hormagaunts and friends. Some of the enhancements focus around them, and to be honest, the other ones aren't really good enough that you'd actually want to use them to run the detachment that much. Again, maybe a lot more clearly than the Firestorm for this one, it means that you just have to have a massively significant portion of your list being Endless Multitudes to really justify this over Invasion Fleets. Even if you did have at least a fairly hoardy Tyranids list with maybe 3 or 4 20-strong swarms, I'd still say that might put you at a level where you're going to struggle to justify this over other picks. I'm sure this will provide great support for that, say, 500 odd points of your army, but then it'll do absolutely nothing for the other 1500 points or so. So you might well have been better with something like Invasion Fleets or Synaptic Nexus as a result, where the other units are going to get some powerful benefits. Kind of means that if you want to play an unending swarm at 2000 points, you probably want to be looking at least 120 plus swarm models, if not more. And while I'm sure there's plenty of Tyranid collectors out there with that many Gargoyles, Termagants, and Hormagaunts in their collection, there's going to be plenty of people where it's just not really going to be an option. Beyond these, for other detachments really quite focused around specific units, the First Company Task Force kind of needs a skew list of veterans to really consider this, given that all the stratagems only work for them. The same for the Space Marine Stormlance, as you really need loads of mounted units there, either some big maxed out squads of Outriders or Thunderwolves. And for the Tyranids, the Assimilation Swarm is perhaps the most typical version of this, given that it only revolves around 4 datasheets in the index, so you need to have them in multiples to have any consideration at all. And maybe the Vanguard Onslaught and Crusher Stampedes to a lesser extent, at least they affect some big chunky sections of the Codex where they've got quite a lot of units in their keyword. It doesn't really look like this will be changing either. For upcoming things in the next codex, the Necrons are going to have formations that are fixed around Cryptex and Canoptech things, or Destroyer Cults and Flayed ones. I'd guess that, like the previous, we're probably going to see very little that helps out any other units in the army, besides those specific keyworded units. The Admech do sound like they're going to have some very keyword locked things as well. One that focuses just on Skitarii, one that sounds like it'll be focusing just on Cult Mechanicus, and then weirdly enough, a Castellan Robot specific one. Obviously, we haven't seen the full rules for that yet, but again, I'd guess that the benefits are going to be pretty restricted to the units in question. I think perhaps the bit that surprised me a little bit was that if you're just running a fairly balanced, say, Space Marine or Tyranid army, you don't really have quite as many options as you might think. For the Space Marines, the Gladius is the obvious one, as that helps out most units with buffs to both moving and inflicting damage, whether you're an assault unit or a shooting unit. Otherwise, I'd say the Vanguard Spearhead is maybe a pretty reasonable one as well. Durability at range is rarely going to be a bad thing, plus it helps out a bunch of varied infantry units in different ways, and gun tanks will definitely like being a bit tougher against enemy firepower. Otherwise, most of the rest are a bit less so. The core benefits of Ironstorm and Firestorm have some helpful enough things, plus they each have one damage dealer stratagem that can affect infantry, but then most of the rest is specific datasheet locked, tanks and vehicles for the Ironstorm of course. And then for Tyranids, it's probably Invasion Fleet and Synaptic Nexus that are the 2 generic picks. The other ones are very keyword locked with both core benefits and stratagems only really helping out the things that they're focused around. I guess at least the Vanguard Onslaught and Crusher Stampede are at least quite big sections of the codex, so it might be a bit less effort for certain collectors to try and skew towards if they want to use those. I'll be interested to hear what you guys think about it. It does have some positives, admittedly. I feel like the new detachments really quite genuinely push army lists in very different ways. It is quite cool to think that you can go out and run a massive Tyranid swarm army and it's got some very dedicated support for it, or maybe the same for a bunch of infiltration organisms. Again, while it heavily incentivizes certain units, it's also not like it actually locks anything out, and there are plenty of units in the Space Marine and Tyranid Codex that are just generic strong picks that'll be helpful in just about any army. Say Space Marine Inceptors swooping down to do secondary points, or the very nasty Tyranid lone operatives like Death Leaper and Neurolictors. Whether or not the detachments are balanced is probably going to happen on a case-by-case basis as well. I don't think that Games Workshop will get it quite so good for most of them. For Tyranids Codex, I think they actually did surprisingly well with that. 4 of the 6 detachments do seem to be at least fairly strong at tournaments. It's only really the Assimilation Swarm and the Crusher Stampedes that get played very, very rarely. And I would say that from first impression, Space Marines maybe seem a little bit less balanced than that. The Ironstorm Spearhead is probably the strongest, maybe very closely followed by Gladius. And I feel like there's good Firestorm and Vanguard lists out there as well, as maybe some of the next tier choices. Anvil, Stormlance, and First Company just seem a little bit less good overall, at least in a competitive environment. And finally, to be fair to the system as well, it's not like the old sub-faction system didn't create units that were real winners and losers within different armies. Say, for example, with Ultramarines really heavily incentivizing rapid-fire type weapons, or High Fleet Leviathan being really big on the Synapse keyword for Tyranids in 9th. Despite all this, though, I still will say that I was perhaps a little bit surprised at just how many of the new detachments seem to require an awful lot of very specific units to really want to run them outside of just fluff and fun type reasons. And I feel like it's perhaps not the most helpful thing in the world for more optimized armies needing to be really quite heavy skew lists of one unit type or another, perhaps not really having all that much overlap from one type of army to the next. I feel like a lot of collectors might well start building towards some of these armies, but I'm not sure I personally want to try and paint up, say, another 1,000 points worth of miniatures just to be able to justify running a certain detachment, not unless it was something that I was very passionate about getting on the board. Maybe also feels like just a little bit of a sales gimmick as well, needing quite so many models to really want to run certain detachments. Say, for example, for the Tyranids Unending Swarm, that player who might have had 80 Termagants already might have been very happy with that amount, but if they really want to run the Horde Army List archetype, then it's maybe a little bit unfortunate to feel a bit more pressured into getting yet more of the same unit and really go down the rabbit hole even further rather than building out more balanced. The same for things like the Assimilation Swarm, where if you don't have, say, 3 Haraspexes in your army, you might as well not bother playing it. Overall, I think I maybe just hoped there might be a few more general purpose picks with a bit of a slant towards one playstyle, as opposed to being quite so heavily built around just literally one set of data sheets within the codex, which seems to be the way that they've decided to go for it. Let me know what you think in any case. Is this something that you've experienced with your Space Marine or Tyranid army lists? Out of the detachments on offer, how many of them would you seriously consider actually running in-game? And have you wound up picking up units literally just to try and make use of certain rules in the detachment, as it just doesn't really make sense to run it otherwise? Let me know your opinions down in the comments, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I do tend to post new 40k videos just about every day, so subscribe or check back later if you'd like to see more. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.